Okay, I think we'll make a start because it's just gone 10:45, and a very, very warm welcome to all of you who have chosen to come along to our workshop this morning. We are really pleased to have this opportunity to present at this international conference. It's very exciting for us. It might be perhaps a little bit scary too, but we will do our best to make sure that this is a very engaging session for you, hopefully informative as well. Hopefully we'll share our practice with you, and that will give you some ideas as well. And certainly we're not putting ourselves forward as the experts here. What we're doing is sharing our experiences with the aim of encouraging conversation between us around this really important theme. So before I go into it any further, I'm going to invite the other people who are with me today. We'll call us panelists, but it feels quite formal, but I'll call the other panel members to introduce themselves. So I'm going to start with Katey.
Hi everyone, I'm Katey Curtis. I am the Learning and Development Manager for a company called Simply Biz. So you probably haven't heard of Simply Biz, most people haven't, but we are pretty much a financial services business. We work with independent financial advisors right through to large financial providers. We are listed on the AIM. We are very ambitious. And in the last 5 years of me being with the business, we've made several acquisitions. The most recent and largest was the Star Ratings people de facto, who you might have heard of. So in L&D, I look after about 350 people over 8 different subsidiaries over 5 different locations. And as I said, I've been with the business for about 5 years, initially in finance, where I headed up the finance team. And then I had a career change about 2 years ago, and now I'm in L&D. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you, Katey. That was brilliant. I'm going to move to Sam now and ask Sam to introduce himself.
Thanks, Nick. Good morning, everyone. My name's Sam Wood, and I'm here today on behalf of Lloyds Banking Group. So hopefully a name that you have heard of. Obviously, the brands underneath the group, we have Lloyds, Halifax, Bank of Scotland, Scottish Widows, many others that you've likely heard of as well. So I've worked in financial services since leaving university, and I've been with Lloyds for the last 6 years now, working in risk management. So my day-to-day role at the moment is as an executive support manager to one of our group risk directors. A typical day can be anything from preparing papers for committees, managing the budget and forecasting across the team, recruitment, and managing our 2 key relationships with our regulators, the FCA and the PRA. So I'm actually an alumni of the University of Huddersfield, so I love having the opportunity to work with students there, and I'll explain a bit more about that later on.
Thank you. Thanks, Sam. And over to Kelsy.
Hi, good morning. I'm Kelsy. This will be much shorter than those guys. I'm a student at the University of Huddersfield doing business management, and I'm about to do a placement in the Aldi's industrial second-year placement scheme.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Kelsy. And just to introduce myself, I'm Dr. Nick Stenberg. I'm the academic lead for employability. I'm a senior lecturer in Huddersfield Business School, and I'm also the module leader for the module that we're going to be talking to you about today. So this session is about higher education. I know that this conference is looking at different educational contexts and environments. What we're talking here about is employer engagement within higher education, but in particular for undergraduates and for a business and management qualification. So I'll just say a little bit more about that first. Let me just work out how to move this on. Okay, so I thought it's just important to remind ourselves of the kind of business and practice context around this. And I'll just share that with you before I talk to you about how we're going to run the workshop. And I think some of these points were picked up earlier on in the opening lecture or opening speakers, and the things that they talked around the kind of changing nature of work and the importance of education changing its relationship to employers. And that's certainly what is reflected in the literature and in our own experiences. So this idea of there being a much more explicit focus on employability within higher education. So those of you in the audience who are from the higher education context will be very aware of this. As providers, we are working very hard to ensure that employability is reflected within our curriculum, and we are measured around employability outcomes, so they are very important to us. We often find that you have core modules on a course that are dedicated specifically to employability and developing those employability skills. But that raises questions around how do we actually teach these skills within the curriculum? And I'm very aware, having heard that opening speaker this morning, that this is a very current question across education. But within higher education, we are really thinking about how do we ensure that our students really gain experiences that build these skills that are relevant to employers. And we see a lot of times now calls for looking for alternative approaches, and this kind of challenge the idea that you can't just teach these skills in the classroom. You need to find other ways of doing this. And project-based learning is one of the methods that is often advocated as a way to develop these attributes. And we know a bit, well, quite a lot about project-based working when it's internally focused, but there's a lot less known about externally focused project working. And that's really what we're going to be talking about today. And what I mean there are kind of live projects, we call them live projects, that require students to work directly with employers on problems or projects that employers have put forward. And really there's questions around what are the challenges of this way of working, what enables this to work well, what are the outcomes for employers, and what are the outcomes for students. So these are all very current questions in the literature, but also within our practice. And today we thought we would share with you our experience of working with live projects in our curriculum, with a view to really opening up that discussion and also hearing about your own experiences too. So I'll just move on. Bear with me, I've got lots of things opening in front of me and some people being asked to be admitted. Okay, so the curriculum that I'm talking about is a business and management curriculum delivered by Huddersfield Business School. And in our second year, we have a core module for our undergraduates. And this module is focused on developing their personal development and employability. It's a 30 credit module, so that's quite a large module. If you look at the number of credits they're covering within a year, it's quite a substantive part of their year. We deliver this at scale in that we have a large number of students doing this module, 150 currently. And as I said, we focus the entire module around employer engagement. So it's entirely focused around live projects. And this is delivered in partnership with 5 different employers. And we're very fortunate to have 2 of those employers with us today. And we have Kelsy, who is one of the students who went through this experience this year. So that's just to give you that context. Okay, so the way that we're going to run this session is that we're going to kind of take you on a journey to tell the story of our live project experience. And we'll have these 5 stopping off points. And at these points, we will bring in the perspectives of the panelists that are here, and we'll also invite your ideas as well in response to some of the questions that we're going to pose. And I can see things are coming into the chat, so thank you very much for that. That's brilliant. What I will do is, as the other panel members are speaking, I will keep my eye on the chat and I'll make sure we bring that in to the conversation as well. Okay, so we're going to start by looking at how do you start a conversation with employers. So as an education provider, as somebody who needs to go out there and find employers who I can work with, what's my pitch in a sense to employers? What can I suggest to them they can gain from this? And similarly, as an employer, if some of you in the room here are employers, then, you know, what is in it for you? What's the benefit of you engaging with higher education and working in partnership on this kind of curriculum? So we're going to start the conversation there. We're then going to look at how we actually launch this to students, and I'm going to bring in Kelsy here to share her experience and her thoughts about what it's like to be to face this prospect of working on a life project as an undergraduate student, and how we do that well, how we kind of set this up so that students feel comfortable and confident working in this environment. We'll then move on to talking about what it means in practice and how we really support the students, and what does that conversation look like between the employer and the student during the process of running a life project. I'm going to pick up on assessment and talk about that as the fourth stopping off point, and I can see there's a question in the chat around that, so we'll directly discuss that there. And then we'll share some final reflections and also invite you to share some kind of learning points or takeaways from this session as well. So that's how we're going to run it. 5 different kind of parts to the session. We will invite you to contribute. Please do feel free to unmute yourself if you want to speak. That would be brilliant. Or you can use the chat as well, and I'll keep an eye on that. So I hope that sounds okay with everybody. Okay, so let's start with the first point, stopping off point, which is the conversation with employers. And I wanted to just start with this question to you, which is, why would an employer want to partner with a university to give students an opportunity to be involved in a life project? So this is my kind of opening question to you as the delegates in this workshop or participants in the workshop, and I wonder if you just mind giving that a couple of minutes of thought and then adding some ideas into the chat, and once we've had a look at those, we'll move on to ask Katey and Sam to share their perspective on this. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes to do that, or if anybody, as I say, wants to unmute, please do so and just speak. Okay, thank you, Angie, for getting us going. Okay, so Angie, you said to grow their own workforce. And I wonder if you'd mind saying a bit more there, given that these are live projects, so students will be there for a short time and then they'll go back to their studies. How would that contribute to growing their own workforce? I'm not disagreeing with you at all, but I wondered if you mind expanding a little bit. Simon, you've said mix of having an issue to resolve and for philanthropic purposes. Okay, so partly it helps the business, but partly they're doing good in terms of kind of social responsibility.
Yeah, I was thinking that if the students have a brilliant experience, which hopefully they will have,
yep.
It might inspire them to want to go and work for that company and bring new ideas, especially if they feel valued. Yeah, I just think...
No, that's brilliant, Angie. Thank you. That's great. And I know that Kelsy and Sam will pick up on that point, actually, exactly that point. So thank you for unmuting and just explaining that. That's brilliant. Picking the talent for the business that Patrick's added there. So also helping the community, but also identifying talent. So I guess, Patrick, that sounds like a similar point to the point that Angie is making, really building relationships. Yeah, so thank you for that. Any other comments from anyone else there? Okay, well, I'll let those keep coming in. I think we'll ask Sam and Katey to share their perspective on this. It's really interesting listening to them because actually there are many reasons, and you'll hear this now, around why as employers this is a positive opportunity for them or something that they welcome. So I'm going to hand over now first to Katey, who's going to talk a little bit more. I'll just move the slide on, Katey, for you. There you go.
Great, thanks, Nick. Yeah, okay, so we've been involved in this this university initiative now for a couple of years. So this time in September will be our third time, and our reasons for wanting to be involved in it have probably changed each time, to be fair. But I've kind of picked three key areas that are really important for us at the moment. So, like Angie said, you know, our talent pool engagement is so key for us. We're really aware now that the sort of traditional workforce is really changing. So, you know, we've got more specialists in our business, more sort of flexible contractual work, and we really need to sort of meet the needs of the business through skills and knowledge now, rather than sort of a conventional defined job description and role that somebody sort of squeezes into. So this project is a really good way for us to work with the university, see the kind of talent coming through the university, and sort of showcase ourselves to them. Another sort of great thing coming out of the project, and this wasn't probably something that I was aware of going into it, certainly wasn't an objective going into it, but diversity. So I know this is key for all businesses, but the uni project, it just gives us such a variety of perspectives and approaches. So, you know, we had students like Kelsy, who works for Direct Line, part-time alongside her studies. We had another student that was working at Sainsbury's, and we had another one who managed a bar. So working with those students allows us to sort of tap into what the companies they're also working for are doing. And they sort of inadvertently have a lot of opinion about that. So I remember Kelsy having a really strong opinion on something that Direct Line were doing that sort of tapped into this project. And it was completely sort of opposite perspective of what we were thinking as a business. And I'll go into that more when I speak later on about the actual project. And I remember, like, the year before, we had a really strong team that gave such an interesting viewpoint on remote working, which was the project at that time. And they sort of put across this idea that remote working makes employees more accountable, and it drives self-learning because they have less immediate access to their peers and manager support. And that's something we had just not considered as a business at all. So it just gives us such a broad range of perspectives, which is fantastic. And, you know, whilst lots of companies try to encourage diversity in the business, I think as you bring people in, they very quickly adapt to your culture, they're influenced by the key people, they're less likely to sort of stand up and give their viewpoint. So doing something like this, you know, you get a really sort of exposed perspective, which is lovely. It's fantastic. And then the last point was sort of being an employer of choice. So again, sort of touching on Angie's point, you know, Simply Biz is not recognised as a company name, you know, but we're local, we're also national, we're also listed, we're also really ambitious, we're growing, and we're an absolutely amazing place to work. And these uni projects really help us to sort of spread that word. And then, you know, what we found is from each of the years, the strongest students have all got in touch to find out whether we do placements or graduate programmes. So it's a relatively easy initiative for us that seems to get, you know, a lot of attention as we'd want it to. So that's it. I hope that was all right.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Katey. And I think that definitely picks up on the points that have been made already in the chat. I think the point around diversity is interesting, and this idea of bringing a whole range of different perspectives into the company that the company might not have had access to. You know, again, I think this picks up on some of the points in the chat about it's an opportunity for you to kind of put forward your company as a prospective employer to the students. And it is what Katey said is absolutely right. We have had students coming after the live project asking, you know, would I be able to approach Simply Biz and ask them to do some work experience with them? So some of the students have really kind of come forward afterwards and sought out other opportunities to continue that relationship. So certainly we're seeing that does happen in practice. So thank you, Katey, for that. I'll just ask Sam now to talk about Lloyds. And from Lloyds' perspective, why get involved in a live project, Sam?
Thanks very much, Nick. Yeah, so there are a number of things really that appeal to me about working with the University of Huddersfield and its students, both from a professional point of view, so from a Lloyds perspective, but also from a personal point of view, and I'll go on to explain that a bit further now. one of the key factors that I know Katey also mentioned was the identification of talent. So typically at Lloyds, the majority of our vacancies are filled internally, and we're a big advocate of promoting internal development. The talent that we do tend to bring in externally is typically at either end of the spectrum. So, you know, very senior executive talent, or typically younger emerging talent, as we call it. Annually, we recruit up to 200 of the top talent across the UK, and working closely with universities like the University of Huddersfield and forming those partnerships with the students and with the universities, it's a really great way to do that. I think another point I'd touch on would be spreading brand awareness and organisational awareness. So for those of you based in the UK, I would hope that, you know, many of our brands are already well received and well recognised with you. But I guess some of the things that I have a perspective on from working for Lloyds, such as our I&D agenda, the awards that we've won for supporting vulnerable customers, things that might not necessarily be in the public domain, through talking to the students and being able to promote other elements of our business, that's something that these live projects really enabled us to do. So that was brilliant. And again, for those based in the UK, you should be aware of where Huddersfield is geographically. As a group, we have some large offices, both in Leeds, in Manchester, and in Halifax. So all, you know, commuting distances from Huddersfield. So if we have vacancies to fill in London, for example, they're very easy to fill. There's a wide pool of talent there. The vacancies in the north, we do find that building relationships with universities like Huddersfield and other local universities, that really helps to drive that local talent through to those hubs. One thing I would also mention is the possibility of future partnerships with the University of Huddersfield. I know I've worked with Nick on one or two things in the past, and a couple of other lecturers as well. So it's not trying to think long term. It's not necessarily just about this project and this piece of work and what we get from this, but it's also about building that partnership further and thinking of the potential benefits that both parties could get in the future. If I briefly touch on from a personal point of view, then I think Robert might have mentioned this in the chat. I really enjoy being involved in this initiative for my own personal development as an individual. So the development of, you know, younger individuals, emerging talent, that's something that I'm really passionate about and something that I don't actually have the opportunity to do in my day-to-day role. So being able to, you know, fulfill that need through other means such as this project, that has been really beneficial for me. And then lastly, I mentioned it very briefly in my introduction, but there definitely was a nostalgia factor. So being a former student of the university myself, being able to come back a period of time later and work with, you know, students where I was in their position not that long ago, it feels nice to be able to give something back and complete the full circle.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sam. That's fantastic. And I think you can hopefully hear there these kind of range of gains that can be made, really. Certainly organisational perspective, but also that individual perspective. And I would say, really, one thing that I think is quite important to think about when you are working with employers is to try and think about, can I recruit people or engage or work with people who the students can find some way of identifying with, in whatever way that is. So it might be about for some students, about having somebody local might be quite important. For others, it's about having a kind of area of work or industry that they're interested in, and also that they might be alumni, so that they're people that have actually sat in the same seats of those students some years ago, and therefore they're role models for the students. And, you know, I hear from the students the importance of that, especially the kind of alumni connection. I think they really do value that. So that's been something I've been mindful of when I've been thinking about which employers can I engage in this process. These are all things that have kind of been very live in my mind. Okay, so I hope that gives you a flavour of the different benefits for employers, and I'm picking up from the chat some other comments there. I think it's Mark who said, who's providing IT support for us. Mark, you said that you've worked with colleges around this and the importance of teachers working with the students at the same time. It's absolutely the same in higher education. I'll talk to you a little bit about that in a minute, about the actual...
Yeah, it was... Nicola, because it was just to say, because I've worked with a couple of local colleges, and what I found when we were working on a live Amazon project with around 10 students, and
yeah,
what I find sometimes, unless you've got the support structure from the college right,
yeah,
and you actually flag what the expectations of what is needed from the employer is so key before you could even go into these live projects, because I found it became into more of a babysitting process because the college hadn't selected people that had the appropriate skills in the first place. I've done several of them and worked with different colleges, but it is so key on whether at college, whether at university, that they are employer ready.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know that it's obviously some of those key things.
Yeah, Mark, thank you for that. It raises a few points actually that I'll pick up in a second now, but you're absolutely right. We have, as I said, it's 150 students. So actually I couldn't say that these students are employer ready. In fact, I could say a proportion of them are, I'd say probably a small proportion at the point that they start working with us on this module, have had experience with employers or have worked themselves and have already have a kind of baseline skill set around that. But for many of them, that is not the case actually. And in fact, that's why it's so important for us to offer these live projects. But it does raise questions about what we ask students to do so that they remain within a certain comfort zone, but they're stretched a bit, but not too much, so it's not too daunting a task for them. And in fact, I'll say a bit about that. So thanks very much, Mark, for raising those points. I think they're really important. So that leads us to the next bit actually, which is about launching the actual live projects to students. And just picking up, Mark, really on your points directly, really, there were things that we did that or that I am learning are increasingly important within these live projects when we launch them. So the first one is really about currency and offering live projects that reflect the current challenges within the business world, and students therefore really recognizing how relevant this project is. So what we're asking our employers to do is identify current priorities, current challenges that are real and live, and the students can recognize that because they've heard about that in the media. You know, they're familiar with these ideas and they start to resonate not only with what they're hearing in the news, but also what they're hearing in the classroom in our other modules. So Katey's live project was actually about flexible working. Ironically, that project brief was developed before COVID, so we were well ahead of the curve, Katey, or you were then, and we were asking the students to think about how, as an employer, Simply Biz can ensure that students their staff have good engagement and are highly motivated in a flexible working environment. And I'll let Katey say a bit more about that in a minute. And for Sam, we were looking at the branch closures within high streets and the implications for customers. And again, these are live issues and debates that the students will be familiar with. So I think that was really important. The second thing was about choice, and this picks up directly on your point, Mark, which is about offering a range of projects so that students can not only choose things that interest them, but they can also choose a project that they feel comfortable, that isn't too stretching and demanding for them. And we have a lot of students that come from different international, so we have a lot of international students who will come to us with different standards of different levels of English and capabilities there, but also different work experiences. And for them, some of those students, it is quite a daunting prospect to suddenly be working on a live project with an employer, UK employer. So again, it's about offering options that they can actually feel are suitable. So we actually have one of our live projects we set up where Huddersfield Business School was the client, and we gave them a live project linked to respond to us as a client, and we had a brief around that, and that felt more comfortable and safer for some of our students. Okay. The third thing is about relevance to them as individuals, and when we created our live project briefs, we identified within that which particular skill set or what kinds of experiences the students are going to gain if they take that live project. And that varied across the live project. So as an example for SAMS, which was about financial services sector, that appeals to students who are interested in working in that sector. So they're going to gain knowledge that is specific to that sector. It was also a piece of work that required quite a lot of research and a thinking about the customer experience. So again, for students that are interested maybe in thinking about a marketing type career, then it would perhaps appeal to them. So we made this clear in our briefs that these are the kind of skills and attributes you will be using and developing if you choose this particular project. And I think that's important because it allows students to match their ambitions and their strengths to a particular opportunity. And then the last thing was that I think it's really important, I've said this earlier, around ensuring that when we launch our projects, we connect with students in a kind of very human way. And what we did is we brought our employers into the classroom, whether that was remotely or virtual or in face-to-face, and allowed the students to actually see who these employers were. They could actually become familiar with who these individuals were who were going to be on the other side to them, so their clients, and they could start to identify and understand them. And we used talking head videos to do that remotely, and we did that by inviting Katey and Sam actually to come to our lecture face-to-face pre-COVID. So that's enough from me. What I want to do now is ask Kelsy, invite Kelsy. So Kelsy is our business and management second year student, but about to start placement very soon. But I want to invite Kelsy to say something to you about what it is like as a student to be faced with this prospect of working on a live project, and how she responded to that when she heard about the live projects. So Kelsy, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about your experience here, that would be great.
Yeah, so initially when I found out we were doing a live project, I was a bit confused as to what it might entail, because it's not just a set presentation or essay where I know exactly what I have to do. So I was a bit apprehensive initially, and then we were presented with, was it 5 choices? Yeah. And then we would rank which choice we would most like to do, because obviously everybody might have wanted to do just one project and it wouldn't work logistically. So we ranked them from 1 to 3, I think, and then I got my first choice, I believe, and then yeah, it was very daunting, especially because we weren't able to pick who we were going to be with, which was kind of like a business environment anyway. You obviously don't pick your colleagues of who you're doing projects with, so that was something I was quite apprehensive with as well, because I prefer to choose who I work with, so I know what their working style's like. So I was placed in a group with a diverse, group of people, and it was very daunting, like I say, but I knew it was a good opportunity to possibly put on my CV in the future, working with an external business. So I just wanted to make the best of it. I know people's contribution vary generally in group environments. So again, I was apprehensive to work with people I didn't know. And as well, I knew there was going to be a much higher level of accountability with live projects, especially because you're working with an external company. So you do actually have to, you want to make a really good impression, whereas if you're just doing a presentation or essay, for example, you could, I don't know, you could, I don't rush things, but you could maybe rush it, whereas you can't with an external business, especially because there's not a lot of context online for you to work on, so you have to collaborate quite closely with the representative from the business. But yeah, overall daunting, but then it became a lot easier as we got to know Katey, who I worked with, for example.
Thanks, Kelsy. And how important is it, Kelsy, to offer choice, do you think, in this kind of environment where we're doing live projects?
Yeah, as you said, sorry, go on.
No, from your perspective, yeah.
Oh, okay. So from my perspective, I I was a bit like, oh, there's too much choice, because I prefer at that time to be told like what to do, so I knew exactly what I had to do. There's a lot of self-management involved, I think, with picking your own project. So I picked, I ranked, I think, both Lloyds and Simply Biz at the top. I wanted to do either or, because I think I prefer working with larger organisations for some reason, because I thought there'd be a lot more context around the actual project, which there was. I thought it was really important to have a range of choices, especially because of the diverse students that we have. So I know there was like a videography one where somebody would, not somebody, but a group would make a video. I'm not sure what it entailed really. And then there was the Simply Biz one, the Lloyds one, and then there was a smaller retail business. And really, I'm just mirroring what you said. It's important to touch upon people's different aspects of what they want to go into after graduation. So this really covered it all. So there was like banking, finance, retail, manufacturing, production, for example. I thought it was really important to have that option. So I went for more like of the larger financial businesses, whereas other students might have not felt comfortable with that at all. Working for Direct Line, I feel like I have a lot of experience in a larger business, so it's not that scary for me, whereas I can imagine with, you know, a 19-year-old who's never worked in an organisation before may find that really overwhelming. So I thought it was good to have a varied amount of choices. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Kelsey. And I think, you know, even for me now listening to Kelsey, it's making me think about my role really, and how I need to be really mindful of some of these things Kelsey is saying. And I think we shouldn't underestimate what it can be like for students to be given this opportunity to work on a live project. And I suppose the assumptions that we might make is, oh, this is fantastic for them, they're going to really develop their skills and it's a great opportunity for the CV. But I think we need to remember that for students this can feel quite daunting and it can feel a bit uncertain, and especially if we're asking them to make decisions about which live project we want them to work on, we have to recognise that even that decision itself can be difficult. And I just think listening to you, Kelsey, highlights for me even more how I need to really scaffold students during that process, that early launching of the live projects, and really understand that perspective and experience. So thank you for sharing that. If anyone's got any questions at this point, please feel free to unmute yourself or put them into chat. We really welcome any involvement from you in this conversation here. I'll just pause for a sec to see if there's anything, and say thank you, Kelsey, for that contribution there.
I'll add another question. It's just obviously from everyone's perspective, with obviously from the university and the student and the employer perspective, what is the challenge now with the current restrictions, and how, obviously, because I can see from students' perspective, when the majority of this will be done through video communication, and the same with the employer, and obviously from the university perspective, what impact does it have on each of those different people?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Great question. I mean, let's start with you, Kelsey. What was it like for you? Because you did have to work on this remotely. We were in COVID lockdown, weren't we? Throughout the whole time we worked on this module, and in fact, it was last September. So I think it was the first term, and I think students were very new to working in this remote environment, as were we as lecturers, less so employers, I guess, but certainly for us, it was quite a big deal. So Kelsey, do you want to just say something about that? What does that mean? How is it different working in that remote environment, do you think, on a live project?
Well, personally for me, I had been working from home anyway from March, so I was really used to like constant Zoom calls. I was used to like just talking to somebody over like Skype, over chat. I had no like other colleague interaction physically in person for months prior to that, so I was already comfortable with the idea of Zoom and like liaising over email, etc. But I know that some people on my team were not, so there was one person on my team who was, I think they were really nervous using Zoom, because it is a bit weird if you've never used it and you're used to speaking to people in person. They didn't want to turn the camera on. They were really scared, so that was one challenge that was obviously huge for our group. So we had to sort of reassure him, but over Zoom. So it was like counterintuitive. But for me, it was fine. Katey was there obviously to give us a helping hand over Zoom as well. And it just felt, it felt natural anyway at that point in September. But I imagine if you did that in March, it may have been a bit more logistically difficult, but again, I wouldn't expect really even in person to, as a university student, to be able to liaise with companies directly anyway in person. I'm sure that Katey has things on at work that probably take priority, do you know what I mean? So having group after group come in and have a meeting, it wasn't feasible. It only seemed feasible over Zoom anyway. So for me, it was fine to operate over these, like, over, I can't articulate, but over, and you know what I mean.
Yes, I know what you mean, over this remote environment. Thanks, Kelsey. If it's okay, I'll let Katey and Sam answer the question when they come on to actually talking about the running of the live projects. If you could pick up that then, I think that would be good. And I think I just wanted to say really there, I think for us as staff, what the message that we gave to the students, and I'm sure a lot of the people in the room might have been saying these things too, is that, you know, whilst this is challenging, it's also an opportunity to develop these remote skills of communication and using different channels. But I know that that is easier said than done. And I know, as Kelsey said, there were students, and she had students in her group who were quite unconfident in this environment. And I think that's another point to consider when you're running a live project, really, is can you offer different ways of communicating with employers so that students can build up their skills and confidence, so that they don't necessarily have to go straight into face-to-face meetings. They might also be able to use email or as a means of communication, or a Zoom meeting perhaps, where they would pose questions but not necessarily show their face straight away, you know, so that you're kind of building up their confidence as well. But I know that Katey and Sam will also have a view on that, so I'll let them kind of share that in a second. Okay, so thank you very much. We'll move on to our next stopping off point, which is about the live projects in action. So what actually happened in these live projects, and how did we support the students? And I think somebody asked about that. I can't remember who it was who said something around this, but the importance of actually really supporting the students through this process. So I just wanted to begin by explaining what my kind of take on this was, as someone who was designing this module. And for me, it's about having these kind of what I call kind of multiple tracks happening, so that the students are getting support from different places, but also actively involved in this process all the time. So two of the tracks here. So the first one is the students. So the students, during the actual doing of the live project, they have a lot of responsibility to self-organize. So we set them up with a brief, but then really there's a lot on them to actually organize themselves as a team, to think about their different roles within that team, to make some quite important decisions about the shape of their project, about what their approach to delivering their project is, about the timescales that they're working in and creating timelines. There's a lot of work for them around decision making. We also expect them to liaise directly with the employer, and Katey and Sam will tell you a bit about what that means in practice. We ask them to prepare outputs, so they have to create something at the end as a result of their live project. And they have to meet the deadlines. So there's lots of things that students are actually doing throughout the period of time that we run the live project. And whilst they're doing that, so they're doing all that outside of the classroom in their own study time, and they're self-organizing around that. In the classroom, we are providing a number of inputs to support that process. So this is happening at the same time. So we cover problem solving and critical thinking, and we introduce some of these ideas. We introduce frameworks that they can use and work with, and we encourage them to think about how they can apply that to their live project. We talk about how they source information. relevant to the brief they're working on, how they apply the kind of models or theories that they might be learning on other modules to this particular brief. We input about professional communication. This was something that was picked up in the opening talks this morning. You know, this skill around communicating professionally using different channels, you know, not at all to be taken for granted really, and something students can really be supported to develop within this environment. So how do you construct an email professionally? How do you ask to speak with an employer professionally and set up a meeting to make that happen? How do you create a presentation that shows that you understand your audience, so a professional presentation? So these were all things that we supported them with and provided some input around. The generic skills that were referred to earlier around emotional intelligence and team effectiveness, we talk about, and similarly we talk about intercultural effectiveness. Most of our student teams are multicultural teams. They bring together students from very different environments, cultural environments. So these are all things that we kind of talk about within our workshops. These were online and live last year, and next year they'll be back face to face. So that's kind of two of the tracks that are going on. But the other track, of course, is the communication that's happening between the employer and the student. So I'm going to ask now our employers again, so Katey and Sam, to tell you a bit about that. So what does live project support actually look like from an employer's perspective? So I'll start with Katey. Thanks, Katey.
Thanks, Nick. Okay, yeah, so it might help if I just set a little bit of context by talking about what our project was. So as Nick sort of touched on, you know, we were in lockdown and our sort of work environments changed quite significantly. So we wanted to sort of look at, you know, this shift to remote working. How can we maintain a high performance culture? How can we support our managers to get the best out of their teams and to sort of approach leadership and personal development while we're all remote? How can the group maintain well-being and positive mental health? And how can we support that returning back to work and social distancing? Because at that point in time, we thought we would be returning to work pretty quickly. So yeah, so as Nick sort of touched on, you know, the briefs provided to the students for them to pick which project they want to work on. And we also sort of do, sorry, I can't see my slide because I've got people's faces there. Let me just move that. We also provide sort of a short video to support that project brief. And then on top of that, we, you know, in the first year did a face-to-face 10-minute slot on the lecture to introduce ourselves and talk a little bit about our perspective of employability skills, and this time that was delivered remotely. And just to touch on the question, that was definitely one of the challenges that came up. So I much preferred being able to deliver that face to face. You know, I'm a learning and development manager. I like to stand in front of people and talk and get my point and personality across physically. And sort of doing that in a box the second time around, I found quite hard, especially because the students at that point didn't feel confident putting their cameras on. So it was pretty much just a blank screen. You can't get a sense of engagement that way, and whether you need to quickly change topic or whatnot. So that was definitely a challenge. But in terms of the actual live project support after that, so I don't know whether this was support or not, but I just wanted to really give the students free range and a you know, just scope to do whatever they wanted, and that might have been too big for them, I'm not sure, listening to sort of feedback, but I didn't want them to be restricted by something they didn't know. I've made it really clear, look, make an assumption if you want to. If you think the answer is to implement an all singing, all dancing system and you don't know how much that costs, just make it up. As long as I know that, you know, there's some kind of idea behind that, that's what I was really interested in. And then in terms of sort of other support, the first year we did this, I just asked the students to communicate with me via email. You know, if they had any questions, don't worry about how many you've got, just ask me. I found that really time consuming and really restrictive, because you generally, when you ask a question and answer a question, it's not you know, that's straightforward, you want to elaborate, and there's usually a follow-up question. And I just like talking, it's probably really clear, and I like a conversation. So so the second time round, I just basically said, look, if you want to book a face-to-face session to ask any questions, let's do that, and I'll give you about an hour of my time. And most of the students took about 20 to 30 minutes, and it was much more effective for me. However, potentially a little bit more daunting for them, and I'd not considered that at all. Also offered sort of feedback, so made sure everybody got some nice detailed feedback personally, and then we did sort of a general session where I could sort of feedback generally about how I'd sort of found the calibre and what people had said and what I'd liked and whatnot. And then I also just wanted to give a little bit back as well. So like Sam said, you know, in his why he was interested in doing it, I didn't want to just sort of end it there. There's some really, really good work done and a lot of effort put in by the students, and we wanted to sort of recognise that by offering them LinkedIn recommendations, offering them time with our recruitment manager around interview skills, CV writing. In the first year I proofread some CVs and things like that. So yeah, you know, that's pretty much what we provided. And, you know, personally, I didn't find that too onerous at all. And I absolutely love engaging with the students. It's a great thing to do. So there we are.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Katey. And I'm going to invite Kelsy now. So Kelsy was one of the students who chose to work on a live project for Simply Biz. So Kelsy did have direct communication with Katey. I'm going to ask Kelsy to share her perspective on what was it like to engage with an employer by emailing, by face-to-face meetings online. How was that from your perspective?
From my perspective, liaising directly with an employer was really beneficial for the project. I don't find like emailing Zoom daunting or anything like that, so I enjoyed being able to have that face-to-face contact. My other team members not so much. Like I say, it just depends on the student really. So I would liaise with my colleagues, let's say, and then generate an email and send that to Katey because they weren't too comfortable initially over Zoom, which I understand, because for months prior we'd be in lectures and there'd be 100 other students and you do not want to turn your camera on because you'd be the only student doing it. So initially I felt fine, but I did understand that it would be quite time consuming sending a huge email with a lot of questions in relation to context to Katey, for example, and she sent a really long and really informative email back. I can imagine it probably took an hour to write, and I was like, oh guys, we need to do something over Zoom because we're taking up a lot of Katey's time just to answer trivialities. So we managed to get on a Zoom call and liaise directly with Katey, which was really beneficial, especially in terms of context, as I've mentioned before. With businesses like Simply Biz and Lloyd's, for example, you can find a lot online about them, but not how they tick internally. Benefits packages, employee perspectives, for example, there's not a lot there. So we had a lot of questions for Katey, and I'm sure Sam got a lot of questions as well, because we had to come up with valuable recommendations for them, and we couldn't give any valuable recommendations without any context. But it was really nice to have that allocated time from Katey, especially, and the communication was consistent and really holistic. For example, anything we needed, she was there to give it to us, and which was really nice. So we were able to sort of lead the project really confidently, thankfully, to that communication.
Sorry, thanks very much, Kelsy. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. I think there's a point just to raise there really for people to think about, which is that different employers will have different preferences. So while students, as Kelsey's been saying, as a student, students have different preferences or different levels of confidence around talking to an employer. Similarly, employers will, some employers will prefer to do or emails quickly, and others will prefer to have these kind of more face-to-face set up meetings. And I think that's something to be aware of if you are designing these kind of live projects, is making sure that you understand from the employer's perspective what works best for them. And as Katey said, for her, it was about having the face-to-face conversation, which was actually really important. So I think, you know, it is important to take some time to understand that. And therefore, on that note, I'll ask Sam to talk about how he managed the kind of live project support. So over to you, Sam.
Thanks very much, Nick. Apologies if there's any background noise. The window cleaner has just decided to start cleaning the window next to me, so hopefully it should be done in a minute or two. But yeah, moving on. In terms of what I tried to do to support the students, number one and the most important thing for me was to provide a really clear and relatable brief. So in my case, as Nick mentioned earlier, I asked the students to consider the future of branch-based banking and what lawyers could do to reduce costs, but also make sure that we continue to support our most vulnerable customers. So I was conscious of, you know, the diverse student population that I was likely to be dealing with. So I deliberately picked a scenario that anyone from any country, any background, any level of knowledge of financial services would be able to relate to. So that was something that was really important for me. Some of the ideas that the students developed were actually really innovative, and you know, some mentioned, would you want to do mobile branches in the back of vans and lorries? I know that's something that we've rolled out over the last year or so. Chatbots, various different uses of technology. So some of the ideas that the students were coming up with were actually really innovative and really helpful. One thing that I know all students may have had some apprehension about, and even employers in our normal day-to-day work, when you are working on projects, you're likely to be in a scenario where you're working with a group of people and you've not necessarily chosen that group of people. That naturally comes with its challenges. So it was clear to me in the submissions that I received, the groups that had worked more collaboratively than others. So the majority of the work I received was, you know, really cohesive to read, even in terms of the formatting and how it looked visually. It was as if one person had written it, which was brilliant. I think naturally, for whatever reason, you are going to get some groups where the dynamic is slightly different and slightly more broken up. And, you know, in some cases it was clear to see that student A had done 2 slides, student B had done 2 slides, and then they just kind of smashed them all together. I think that's, and I provided that in my feedback to the students, that regardless of who's doing the work, if you're presenting something back to an employer, or if I was presenting something back to someone at work, it needs to appear as a cohesive piece of work. So that's something that I think I may mention in the initial brief the next time we do this. In terms of my contact with the students, I know Katey mentioned she was very happy to do things over Zoom calls, that sort of stuff. That's, if I'm being perfectly honest, not something that I'd considered. I was happy for students to reach out to me via email, happy to respond at any time and any number of frequency. I'm not precious about that at all. I guess for me personally, the benefit of doing it via email was if I didn't have time on a particular day to respond, I could quickly do that on an evening or on a morning before I logged on and started work. But what I will probably consider in future is giving the students the option, because like Nick said, whilst employers will have different preferences, so do the students. So if students might be a little bit nervous and apprehensive, you know, I might encourage them to set up a Zoom call to help them develop in that area. But ultimately, I don't want to make anybody feel uncomfortable. So if they would prefer communicating via email, then that's also fine. One thing that I would comment on is, I think Katey commented on kind of the volume of responses and emails and things like that she got, which was great. I'd say I probably received correspondence other than the final submission from maybe half of the groups. And I don't know if that was, in a way, I'd take that as a good thing, because I hope my brief was clear and relatable and it didn't leave them with any questions. But I always think to show, you know, that you're being proactive and that you are engaged, I would always recommend for students to reach out to employers. Obviously not with trivial questions, but, you know, really try and think about what extra information could I be asking for here to help inform my work. So moving on then, in terms of the learning that I hope the students got from it, and some of them, you know, provided me with feedback and Katey and Nick with feedback. So I'm pretty confident that these were covered. But in terms of the learning, it's not just about the specific project and the specific scenario. For me, it's about their knowledge of financial services, the knowledge of Lloyds as a group, how to conduct research themselves. I think some students in the first year, pre-COVID, actually did some primary research where they went and, you know, stood outside branches and asked people to fill in questionnaires, that sort of thing. I thought that was really interesting. And like everybody's touched on already, having to now work in a remote environment, getting used to the technology, taking yourself on and off mute, making sure your background's appropriate, no background noise like window cleaners and things like that. Or to get the students comfortable with that, regardless of when I eventually go back to an office, there will always be some element of remote working. So I think the quicker and the more comfortable students can get with that, the better. And I guess to finish, as a general rule, the caliber of work that I received was really, really strong. And I know we called out a couple of groups in particular at the end for some special recognition. So I've genuinely been really pleased with the standard of work that I've received. And like Katey, this is the completed 2 full years of working with Nick and the students on this. And come September, we'll be happy to do it all over again. Just to answer the question that was posed earlier around doing the project remotely versus in person, I'm the same as Katey. My absolute preference would be to stand in front of a group of people and talk to them, see the whites of their eyes, judge their body language. And I think that makes it, for the students, I imagine, a lot more relatable. So, you know, come September, depending what restrictions are or aren't in place, if we could do that, that would personally be my preference. But as I mentioned before, there is always going to be some element of remote working. I've been sat in this little office since March of last year, and I don't expect to return to a Lloyds office until at least October. So, and you know, I would imagine from a cost cutting perspective, lots of companies will encourage their employees to work from home in future. So yeah, I think finding the balance of remote working and, you know, working with people face to face is key, because they do both have the pros and cons. And I'll finish there, Nick.
Thank you very much, Sam. That's fantastic. So lots of really good points there around how to ensure that employers are involved in that process of providing support alongside us as the education provider. There's a question from Patrick. Are the students paid in any way during these experiences? So they're not, no, Patrick, it's part of their curriculum for their degree. So these are credits that they earn. So by completing the module and passing it, they earn credits that contribute towards their degree, but there's no financial transaction. Kelsy, I'm interested in your view. Do you think that is reasonable, or do you think that you would have liked some element of financial recompense for your efforts?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. I don't, maybe perhaps in the form of recognition, if the company were to incorporate some of the responses that we gave. Although I'm sure I know that they probably do have huge teams that are like innovative and do think of these things anyway, and it's just more just to develop students like experience with working with third-party companies. Although if I gave an idea that was monumental, I would like recognition for it, but it is often not the case.
Thanks, Kelsy. I mean, I think it's a really good question, Patrick, because it raises this point around recognition, doesn't it? You know, if we're not offering financial, there's obviously the credits they gain for their degree, but are there other ways that we can recognise students' contributions? And we do a couple of things which I'll talk about in a sec, but I'd like to think there's more to do here in this around this, so it's a good prompt. Robert, you said as a live project, how much time do the students spend with the employers? Yeah, over how much time does the project run? 3 months. Yeah, good question. We didn't explain that. So we launched the projects in the 2nd week of the term. So we had a 12-week term. And in the 2nd week, we launched the projects to students, and by the 3rd week, they have chosen which project they want to work on, and they start that process. Then 5 weeks later, they submit their output, and that can vary depending upon the live project, but they submit that to the employer. So actually, in the case of both Katey and Sam, they were submitting a presentation that responded to the brief and put forward recommendations. In others, they created a video. I can't remember this. So there's a range, and in fact, in one that we ran 2 years ago, they actually had to raise money, and it was for a charity, and they had to present what they had achieved there. So it varies across the projects, but it is the case that they all have only 5 weeks. So it's very intense period of time for the students. And alongside that, they will be working on one other module. So they've got something else happening as well that they're doing at the same time, but they are expected to devote quite a lot of time to the live project outside of their lectures. So at the end of the 5 weeks, they submit their project output to the employers, and then we go into a process of getting them to reflect on that experience and prepare for assessment. So I'll tell you a little bit about that now. I'll just pick up another question. Could you see the model transferring to FE providers, potentially as part of work experience or industry placement? It might be a smaller scale, but it seems as though there is some transferable. Absolutely. I do think that there is transferability here. I don't see why this model couldn't work in other educational contexts. There were some similar examples given actually earlier on in the opening presentations around FE. So I definitely think so. And I think it's about thinking about, again, the types of live projects that are offered, about the level of support and scaffolding that is provided through that process, to ensure that that is appropriate for the students' level that they're learning at and the educational context. So Robert, you've said speakers for schools already do this one. I don't know, Robert, if you'd mind unmiking yourself maybe and just saying a bit about that. I don't know about that project.
Yeah, sure. Well, I run the work experience for my company down here in Cornwall, and during the COVID lockdown back in, was late summer, so sort of time that Kelsy started her thing, the local careers hub partnered up with Speakers for Schools, which is London based, to run a trial with schools in Cornwall to try and provide a work experience where obviously everything had been shut down over the summer, so very different work experience went ahead, but we tried ours. On the platform for us was just a way of advertising to get students onto our work experience. We'd already successfully run a virtual work experience, but basically most other companies that were doing the ones that I've looked at, were basically running a project-based kind of work experience where they were given some tasks and then had to go away and work on it, but generally on an individual basis. Each student was working by themselves to produce answers to the project and the questions that they were given over 3 days. So the project was just a 3-day project, a work experience. The difference to what we did, we used completely online platforms and actually had teams of students working together on a coding exercise. But yeah, Speakers for Schools do that. They listed, have schools on their platform from all around the UK. And the last time we ran one via them at Easter, we had 69 applications from all around the UK.
Fantastic. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, it's a good platform.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for sharing that. That's interesting. I mean, I think, you know, I would certainly be open to more conversations around this, talking with our FE providers and with schools. And it, you know, it's prompted me to think maybe we could do more locally, actually. And there's no reason why our students involved in live projects couldn't then be offering support to students in schools or colleges as well, or working alongside them. So yeah, that's given me food for thought actually there. So thank you for that contribution as well, Robert. Brilliant. Okay, so I'm just checking that I haven't missed any questions. I don't think I have now. I think I've covered those, but please do keep adding in questions or unmute to share experience. Okay, so I just want to move on to the kind of last stopping off point before we talk about our kind of takeaways from this. And this is about how we assess students' performance within this kind of live project context. And there was a question right at the beginning actually about this. How do you assess students' learning and outcomes? So again, I thought I'd start here with a question to everybody that's here really, which is your thoughts or even your experiences. Robert, you talked about the Speakers for Schools initiative, but you know, how do we assess the learning outcomes that are associated with working on a live project? So how can we assess them? And I guess crucially, what are we actually assessing? So if you don't mind just sharing your thoughts on that, I'll give you a few minutes just to write down some points. We'll take a couple of points from the chat. And of course, if anyone would rather speak rather than write into the chat, then please do that. So any thoughts from anybody around how do we assess the learning outcomes associated with live projects? So Mark, thank you for getting us going here. So having feedback from employers about the work. So yeah, thank you. And we'll talk about how we did that. That's absolutely the case for us. And the success of the project. So that's interesting, how we measure the success of a project. Wonder what you think there, Mark. How do we measure success of a live project? Okay, well, I'll let if there's any more ideas come in, I'll pick them up as we're just sharing our experiences on this project. So there are a few things that I wanted to say really about our approach to the live projects. And the first thing is about making sure that it is these two things, meaningful and timely feedback from employers, and it's formative feedback that we used. So this was our approach. So we had, I said it was only 5 weeks, and very quickly after the students submitted their output to the employer, they got formative feedback from the employer about that output. And we did that very quickly so that they could then use that feedback to go on and use it for their summative assessment. So we asked our employers, Katey and Sam, to tell us what they thought about the work that was submitted, and they gave kind of bullet point feedback to the students about the strengths of the work and also how they think it could be improved further. That was offered very quickly at the end of the 5 weeks, and we also asked our employers to nominate projects that were particularly strong. So linking into your point, Mark, about the success of the project, and actually student engagement, you've added that student engagement was one of the elements that Katey and Sam and our employers were mindful of when they were making these awards to celebrate performance. So I'll just pause, actually invite Katey and Sam. I'll put you on the spot, but I don't know whether you mind saying something about what it was like to give that formative feedback to the students about their work. Katey,
I mean,
so Sam,
oh.
you go first.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think, like I alluded to earlier, because the majority of the work that I received, the standard was, I would say, good. It's always easier to provide positive feedback, isn't it? I think where there were particular areas where things could have been done better, I was happy to provide that. Obviously, I wouldn't want the student's first interaction with an employer to be a negative or a harsh one, perceived in that sort of way. So even if I was providing constructive feedback, I would ensure that I was always, sandwiching that in with some positive feedback as well. I think depending on it, if we were to know a bit more about the students, for example, the individuals and their experience, you might potentially expect higher standard of work from some than others. But I think for consistency, you need to treat all the submissions exactly the same. But again, conscious that they are students, it's the first interaction with an employer. I wasn't perhaps as constructive as I might have been if I'd received that from someone in my own team who works in that sort of professional environment.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. Thank you. Katey.
Yeah, it's interesting listening to Sam. I took a completely different approach and sort of, delivered the feedback as if it was somebody in my team. I thought, the caliber was outstanding, and I'm always wowed by something. So, last year I was blown away, and then doing it the second year, they seemed an even stronger set of students, and I'm really excited to see what we see. But, we'd be doing the students a disservice. Personally, I feel I would be doing the students a disservice if I didn't give them what I consider, fair but accurate feedback. And so, what I did find hard, Nick, was I think you'd said maybe 3 points, and I just wanted to keep going, especially with some of the stronger ones around the positives. But yeah, I think there were, at least 1 or 2 bits of constructive feedback, and it's what I expect of my manager. And I'll really take away though from this conference, whether that's what I do next time, and just how it might be received. And Sam's right, this is potentially the first time students are hearing feedback like this. So I don't think I was harsh, but I wouldn't want to soften the blow. But it is valuable. Feedback is so valuable. We don't know what we don't know until somebody tells us. So yeah,
thank you. Thanks, Katey. And what about you, Kelsy? So being on the receiving end of getting feedback from an employer about your work, what was that like?
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I like really constructive feedback, like critical feedback. I do like positive feedback, obviously, who doesn't? But I want to know where I can, in the future, if there was something I was doing really wrong, what I can do to correct myself. Because especially because we're all going to go for graduate jobs and placements, and in interviews, if I'm giving some sort of impression, or there's something about my professionality that's not tip top, I don't want to accidentally express it during an interview, for example, or even in a group assessment. So the more brutal the better, I think. So I really like Katey's feedback, because she didn't ignore little things that we could do. She pointed them out so we can correct them in future, and I thought it was really good for so we can be more cohesive as a group in future as well, because there was something she picked up on that some people might just ignore, involvement from some of the team members, because obviously some students might not be as engaged as others. But I think it's important to point it out, because if I was to work in a business, it would definitely be pointed out. So that's why I really appreciate constructive feedback more so. So for me, it was personally really advantageous to get lots of intricate feedback.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kelsy. Thanks for that. And I think that really echoes what I heard from our other students, because what we then did is we went on to do our summative assessment by asking the students to write a report about their experience of delivering the live project. So what we were assessing was not their performance on their live project, but we were assessing their ability to reflect and learn from that experience. And I think that's a really important differentiation and something to consider when you're running live projects. And what I said right at the beginning to the students was, don't worry if it doesn't quite work out. Okay, that's fine. What we want you to do is to reflect on why that happened and what you can learn from it. And I think if you can give that message to students, it allows them to be a bit more risk-taking. It allows them to go outside their comfort zone in recognition that if they don't quite make it and it doesn't quite work, for instance, they might try to be too ambitious and therefore really struggle to meet their deadline and then deliver a kind of coherent presentation. Don't worry, what we want to know is what you've learned from that. And I think that's such an important message, isn't it, for all of us really, which is about being open to learning from the process. And therefore it was about these three things at the bottom of this slide. So self-awareness, so what have you learned about yourself through doing this project? And obviously that linked into everything we were covering within the lectures, around emotional intelligence, for example, around group working. So we were asking them to reflect on their self-awareness and link that to the literature and the ideas we were sharing with them. We asked them to really highlight what their learning was, but then to use that for future planning, to think about, therefore, what might you need to develop or consider in the future as you prepare for either your placement or graduation and going into employment after your degree. So this was our approach, and our assessment was all based upon that report that they wrote, that reflective report. Katey's just added, giving feedback is an opportunity to recognise those in the team that have gone the extra mile, and let those who haven't know, and it's up for them to take it on board. I think that's a good point, Katey. And in fact, I know because Katey had contact with different people in the group and got to know them a bit, she was able to give that more personalised feedback to the group. I know that that really mattered to the students, because when I read their reports, all of them were commenting on that feedback, and they were commenting on what they had learned from the employer feedback and what they had realised from the employer feedback. And it really highlights for me how much that really matters to them. Mark, you've added, when we completed projects, we try to have project leads that you appoint after the initial meeting. After Myers-Briggs training, different people have different communication needs. Yep, I agree, Mark. We didn't tell the students that they had to identify someone, but many of them adopted that approach of identifying a project leader or a project manager, again, based upon the attributes and skills that they already had at the beginning of the live projects. So that definitely did happen. And some of them reflected on the fact that they perhaps didn't have that, and that was a problem. So again, that was also picked up in the reports at the end. So after kind of working through that process of delivering the live projects, we just wanted to use these last few minutes to talk about kind of final reflections. I think I've said a lot already, but what I'd like to do is just ask each of our panel members to say one thing which they would, I guess, have their kind of takeaway point around the experience of being involved in a live project, and maybe a message that they would give to other people. And whilst they're doing that, please feel free to add into the chat perhaps what your takeaway is from this workshop. You know, what's the one thing that you've taken away that maybe it's made you think about, or you'd like to know more, or maybe it's just confirmed something for you that you knew already. But again, please do use the chat just to share that, because that's really helpful and interesting for us. But in these last few minutes, I'll just ask each of our panel members to just say that one thing. So I'll start with you, Katey, if that's okay.
You know me, Nick, I can't come up with just one thing.
I know, one thing, Katey.
Because I can't. Really, I think, you know, the takeaway is going to be as personal to the business and what they want to get out of it. But this is a fairly easy initiative to be involved in. It's not onerous at all, and it's incredibly rewarding for, you know, for me personally, for the business, and seemingly for the students. So there isn't a takeaway really, just, you know, showcase your business, do what your business does, and, you know, the students have the opportunity then to do what they want to do.
Brilliant. Thank you, Katey. That's great. I mean, I think the key message there about it doesn't have to be too onerous, but it can be quite impactful. So that's good to hear. All right, thanks, Katey. And to Sam.
Yeah, I guess I'd just say, regardless of what position people are in who've joined this conference, whether you work in further education, whether you're an employer yourself, doing something like this, providing everybody goes into it with their eyes open and with the appetite to get something meaningful from it, it really is beneficial for all parties. It's quite obvious what the students get out of it. From a further education provider perspective, they get good work from the students, development of their students, relationships with employers. Particularly, I think local relationships are important, like you touched on, Nick. And from an employer's perspective, I know me and Katey, we both did a full slide each on the various benefits that we've got, both professionally and personally. So I think as long as you go into it with the right attitude and the right intentions, there's nothing to lose.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sam. That's brilliant. So again, similar messages there from employer around the benefits of doing this. So thank you, both of you. And Kelsy, your kind of key message as a student.
As a student, it was really interesting to see theoretical roles come into real life project management. So I really enjoyed that, especially I didn't realise I enjoyed that until the reflective piece. So the reflective piece was even better at sort of heightening my empathy for other team members and how they actually operate internally. As well, I can say with confidence that it's really heightened my employability and helped my CV develop a bit more as well. So it was beneficial all around, really.
Great. Thank you, Kelsy. And Kelsy has gone on to secure a placement with Aldi, and we really congratulate her from that, because it's a fantastic achievement. It's very competitive to get those placements, and Aldi in particular is a very competitive placement provider. So Kelsey's done brilliantly well to get that. So congratulations to you there, Kelsy. So that brings us to an end of the session. Thank you very much to everybody who has come along and joined us today. Thank you for your contributions in the chat. I'd like to also say a huge thank you to Katey, Sam and Kelsy for giving up their time to join us today. It is my absolute pleasure to work with Sam and Katey every year on this, and also to have the experience of teaching Kelsy and involving her in this conference. And credit to you, Kelsy, for coming along and speaking at an international conference. It's another thing you can now put on your CV. So a big well done there as well. Thank you, everyone, for your comments. Kelsy, you're getting people acknowledging how good it is to hear your perspective on this. So that's really nice feedback for Kelsy as well.